Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gabesty here. This is the Heroic Quick Raid Guide for the Fallen Protectors. And you can click on the annotations at the bottom at any time to check out the other videos for this fight. So for Rook Stonetoe on Heroic, there are a few different changes compared to normal. As always, if you want to know the basics for this encounter, which I don't really cover in the Heroic Guide, you can check out the normal guide for this fight. So for Rook Stonetoe, his Corrupted Brew ability, which is his main attack, where he throws a barrel at some random player, this will travel at a faster and faster rate as he progresses through the fight. This travel time is then reset to the standard travel time once he enters Desperate Measures. So every 2 times that he throws a barrel, the time it takes for the barrel to land is reduced by half a second, essentially. However, because of the length of the fight, you're only given 10 minutes at most before the Berserk, and because you're arbitrarily or forced to push the bosses through Desperate Measure phases at least twice, you just never get that many stacks. There just isn't enough time for Rook to throw that many barrels. So the fact of the matter is, you probably won't see more than 4 or 5 stacks of this buff, and therefore it's not that dangerous. The more dangerous aspect for Rook on Heroic is his Desperate Measure phase, and the 3 adds that spawn, the Embodied Misery, Sorrow, and Gloom. On Heroic, these share a health pool, which means you cannot simply burn the one that you want to kill right away and deal with the others later. Therefore, they're alive much longer and are obviously more dangerous because of this lifespan, but because in Heroic, the abilities do a lot more damage. So the most deadly one is Embodied Gloom by far, because its Corruption Shock ability does over 300,000 damage to the target and anyone close by. So it's really important that everyone interrupts the Gloom spawns, or the Gloom cast rather, when it is active. So there you can see the trio mob spawning. The Embodied Misery should still be picked up by one of your other tanks, preferably the tank that's on Softfoot. And then the Sorrow will use Inferno Strike just like normal. But on Heroic, again, this does a lot of damage, 1.6 million. So make sure that player's stacked up with the raid. So here you can see we're kind of all stacked in melee range of the Gloom, and then we're using a interrupt rotation on that Gloom's Corruption Shock cast to make sure you get every one of them. Now for Sun, the big change on Heroic for her is actually fairly minor. Again, she gets more dangerous over time prior to being reset from Desperate Measures. In this case, her Calamity ability gets stronger. It starts at 30% of everyone's health for the first cast, and each cast it goes up by a 10% increment. However, just like the stacking ability for Rook, Calamity is just not cast that frequently. So in our first kill, which was nearly a 10-minute full Berserk timer kill, we only saw 7 casts of Calamity in total. So if you consider that you're resetting the stack count of hers, the Calamity damage, at least 2 times from 2 Desperate Measure phases, you average that out, the most you're going to see is 50 or 60% of your player's health from a Calamity hit. So at worst, you have to cool down 1 or 2 of these over the course of the fight. But other than that, it's pretty minor. So the only other change on Heroic is no really additions, but her Shah Seer ability is quite dangerous, so you should watch for that. The damage of this ramps up every time it ticks over the course of the channel. For that reason, the final few ticks are about 200,000 damage, whereas the first starting tick is only around 40,000. So to mitigate damage of Shah Seer, either have players that are targeted by it move away from other players, or interrupt the Shah Seer cast about halfway through its channel. This will maximize the damage reduction and basically stop around 60-65% of the total damage it would deal, because it ramps up over time. So finally we have Mr. Softfoot, who's the most dangerous of the bosses by far, primarily because of the damage he deals to the raid that's pretty much unavoidable through the Garrote ability. Obviously, just like a normal, this will be cast on random raid members, and the damage is pretty severe on Heroic, and it's reset, all the stacks are dropped once you push them into Desperate Measures. But until that occurs, the damage is going to be quite high, so at the end of the fight, you might find that 20% or more of the damage to the entire raid was from Garrote alone. Other than that, the main difficulty with him is that he now drops poison clouds all around the room, because he'll use the poison abilities when he does things like garrote or randomly attacks a player, not just while he's attacking the tank. So, because of this, it's important that your raid is aware of poison that might be under them and has a quick way to, know if this is the case and get out of it rapidly, because it does a ton of damage pretty quickly. Other than that, he has his normal Desperate Measure phase, where he spawns the single embodied anguish. On Heroic, this isn't any different than the normal version, except it does a lot of damage, as you might suspect. So it's really important that because it has more health, and therefore you're going to be in the phase longer, that you have a proper rotation for handling the passing of the Mark of Anguish, so that players can properly cool down and last as long as possible. That said, you do not want to hold it any longer than you can survive. So if you have cooldowns that will keep you, solid for 9 or 10 seconds, if you wait for that 10-second mark and your cooldown drops, you could very well die instantly. So because the stat count is going to be really high. So make sure you have a proper order set up beforehand. You know who you're targeting. Do not target anyone that is a tank player because there's an armor reduction debuff. But all other 8 raid members are completely valid. And then just pass it once you have run out of your own cooldowns to the next player in the rotation. If everyone is alive, you should be able to kill it before you run through all 8 players. So finally, we need to discuss the ordering of which bosses you kill and the positions of the raid and the bosses. Now, the DPS requirement for this fight is not extremely severe, but it is significant enough if you're progressing on this encounter, depending greatly on your raid's gear, DPS overall, and if you're using 2 or 3 healers. That said, the best things we found were to prioritize the boss orders such that it allowed your raid to stack the bosses together when you had big DPS cooldowns, such as Bloodlust going. So for this reason, we started with Sun Tenderheart first as the first Desperate Measures target and stacked all 3 bosses in the center during Bloodlust and such. Once Sun enters her phase, then you can move the rogue Softfoot out because his poison clouds will start to stack up after that. But prior to that, you have no poison clouds active at the time when you start the fight, so you can kind of keep them in the center. You won't get very many clouds down, and this will kind of keep the middle of the room clean, pretty much. And this gives you a lot of extra AE cleave time. And then we do Rook second, just because we want to do Softfoot last. Once he's done, we go back to Sun, and since he's Desperate Measures clears out all the poison clouds, once again after he ends his Desperate Measure, you can stack all 3 bosses in the center again for another round of cleave and AE damage. And overall, take advantage of that period because that's where you'll get most of your DPS gains to beat the Berserk timer. Other than that, positioning is just really a matter of handling the Desperate Measures for Rook when you have the trio mobs so that players are stacked up for the fire explosion, and you are not stacked with anyone if you have Shaw Seer. You dodge the kegs from Rook and otherwise avoid the poison clouds. But because Sun stays in the center, the majority of the time the raid will be in the center, especially melee players and tanks around there. So that's it, really. This fight is not all that mechanically different on Heroic. You just have a few little changes and tweaks, but mostly it's just a matter of meeting the DPS and healing requirements of all the numbers that have been increased over the normal versions quite significantly. That is the Heroic Quick Raid Guide for the Fallen Protectors. As always, good luck, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed, please subscribe.